Hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today I am joined by my friend and co-host, spiritual guru, the founder of Propulsion AI, Scott Morris. And Scott, I've said it before, the CHRO and the CFO relationship is a little bit like a marriage between logic and emotion. I'm not going to say which one is which. Finance measures what is, HR argues for what could be, and somewhere between those two truths, the business either scales or it stalls. And I think the real tension is that we say that we're partners, but too often we're fighting for narrative control instead of building one story that the CEO and the board actually believes.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you're a fan of the old Star Trek, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy. Before we get going, before we dive in, let me ask the audience, if you like the pod, please take a second and subscribe or leave us a comment. And you know what? It doesn't even have to be an earth-shattering insight that you leave. We want to hear what you're thinking. Leave a comment. Drop us a review on your favorite platform. It's how we grow the pod, and it's how we keep the content sharp for senior leaders.
So thank you, Scott, for that. Let's start with just getting the reality of the modern C-suite. Every CHRO says they have a great relationship with the CFO. And that happens until budget season. And then the smile fades and the spreadsheets come out. And then I'm usually asking how to do a pivot table. And in most companies, finance holds the microphone because they tell the story in numbers. HR tries to translate talent impact into dollars, but that story, it's usually not really bulletproof. It gets rewritten in accounting terms. And we saw this play out as recently as 2024 when the Meta CFO described their workforce reduction as a capital reallocation to higher yield functions. And that language told investors we're serious about returns. Now, if you were an HR person, you would say, we're doing a reorg. Finance called it leverage and Wall Street rewarded it.
You know, when HR doesn't co-own that narrative, we end up being the cost center that finance manages. And it's like we're not the investment partner that finance amplifies. You think about companies like Microsoft, Jackson, Amy Hood, the CFO, and Kathleen Hogan, the CHRO, they operate as one system. Their joint narrative is about return on capability. And every workforce move that it seems that they make is tied in some way to growth metrics. And I don't think that's an accident. It's by design.
I think that's right. And the best CFOs, they don't need HR to know GAAP. Although I know GAAP, and let me tell you, you're not missing anything.
Well, I don't.
And you shouldn't. But the CFOs need HR to know how human capital shows up in the P&L. They want someone who can explain why revenue per employee is falling before the auditors ask. And if you think that's just a crazy thing to say, let me tell you, I lived that. And I was the one that figured out that we were expanding our OpEx at a rate way more escalating than the top line was growing. And the HR guy really shouldn't be figuring that out, but that's another story. What a CFO wants is a CHRO to understand headcount, not as belly buttons, but as deployed capital.
And let's be honest, most CHROs walk into the CFO's office talking about engagement and things that matter to us deeply, but the CFO hears cost. When you talk about speed to productivity or retention of top talent or margin impact of turnover, that's when our finance partners start to listen because it's a language that they understand.
Yeah, and we need to adapt that, but the story isn't that people matter. And that, I think, sometimes is what we end up bringing to the table. Up with people, for those who remember the Super Bowls back in the late 80s or late 70s, early 80s. I think the story we have to be able to tell cohesively is people create measurable delta. So to that, let's dive in. And I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on, are HR and finance actually telling two versions of the same story, or is it like two completely unrelated stories?
Well, at the risk of sounding like I'm flip-flopping on my own sort of part of the intro that we did, maybe they shouldn't. Maybe we shouldn't be trying to tell the same story, right? Finance narrates the efficiency of the business and capital allocation, and HR narrates capability building and organizational resistance. And I think the problem isn't divergent narratives, maybe. It's CEOs who lack the sophistication to synthesize both. Shouldn't we be able to hold both of those in our heads at the same time?
Yeah, but it has to be part of a cohesive narrative, doesn't it? Because if you go back to the Ram Charan discussions in Talent Wins, he'll talk about you have a CEO, the CFO, and the CHRO, and that's kind of the triangle that should run and deploy capital, financial and human, across the organization. And if you are doing that, what you just said is two of the three can't do what you're talking about. So I got bad news for you. If there are three of you and two are aligned and you're not, the problem
You're
isn't them. The problem is you. So, like,
well, let me try and poke another hole in this then.
okay.
Does this narrative even start with the fact that like finance is right and HR is wrong? Is that our starting point for this whole thing? That somehow they're right, their metrics are right, their way of looking at the business is right, and the way that HR looks at the business is not right?
Look, I think it's because they're telling incomplete stories, because most of what they have is looking backwards. They're lagging indicators. In fact, they put in every single time we go in front of a earnings call, we say these have forward-looking statements, but you should ignore them completely, which of course means please pay attention to our forward-looking statements. It's like when someone says, well, I don't want to offend you. Just know that whatever comes next, you are totally,
And I mean that with all due respect.
which means no respect whatsoever.
No respect, right?
But, you know, in a perfect world, and I'm going to take the optimist view versus the pragmatic one, so this feels weird. This is what Scott feels like every day. We should have one cohesive narrative that is aligned with the financials, which is how we measure it, both short and long term, and with what we're trying to accomplish, which is both short term and long term, and tied into the underlying business performance. What I would tell you is we end up talking about the soft stuff and the up with people stuff, but we miss oftentimes the economic realities that constrain what the options are. And so we end up not having the convergence that we need. And next thing you know, if you have two uniquely bespoke narratives, the one with math is going to win. Because at the end of the day, and I think your dog is agreeing with me.
So for people who don't know, I have a 175-pound Great Dane that we try and put in the basement when Jackson and I do this show. But if you heard him, it's not working.
No, if you have a 170-pound dog, they talk when they feel like talking.
Right.
I have a baby husky. They have a similar desire to engage in conversations whenever the mood strikes them. My point coming back is at the end of the day, because of the regulatory environment that most companies are in, because of the accounting associated with it, and that is ultimately, from a fiduciary standpoint, what boards are worried about. If there is a tie, it will go to the ones that do. So I got bad news. If you want your narrative to be a part of the broader story, you've got to attach it and co-create it with finance. You can't have your own.
Well, I think the co-create's really important. Here's my synthesis of kind of this part of our conversation, and my own challenge to my starting point is that if you're going to sit and have a conversation with someone, for that person to engage you in a discussion, you have to have credibility. And if you can't come to the table talking about the numbers that drive the business, you're not going to be able to engage in a credible discussion with the CFO, where ultimately you can start to balance short-term, super measurable on the balance sheet, items and longer tail initiatives that are driving longer-term performance and harder maybe to measure. But you've got to have the credibility to even have the conversation.
I think that's true. And what you are measuring matters. And you and I have talked about this before. If you're talking talent density, it's a natural connect point. If you're talking engagement score, there isn't. So I think that leads to my question for you, Scott, is does HR still think that their credibility comes from empathy instead of accuracy?
You talk to a lot more CHROs as a part of your coaching practice than I get the opportunity to do. But I think inevitably the answer is yes. It's a big mistake that most of us in the profession at some time or another have made. But I also think it's a little bit of false choice in the sense that empathy goes a long way to helping build psychological safety. We've talked about that as a subject on this pod before, and the ability to deliver hard truths. Accuracy makes those truths actionable. And I think you need both of those. You don't need one or the other.
That's true. And let me push on the word accuracy, because the way I structure the question, it assumes that what finance is able to measure is accurate. And that's not always true. I would argue that there are subjective calls that CFOs make all the time. Risk assumptions, growth projections. Heck, even look at, if you're making an investment, whatever you decide as your future cash flow discount rate to be able to bring it back into a net present value analysis, like that number turns something that is good to something that is bad without anything underlying in what you're actually accomplishing. I came from an industry where that judgment became a super important one in deciding whether the company was profitable or not, because you had so many kind of things that we're looking for. Anyway, HR should not abandon empathy-informed judgment, because the soft stuff does matter over time, and they shouldn't abandon it to chase false precision. But you do need to lock things in my view, to business outcomes. Whether you kind of got there with empathy, you got there with spreadsheets, it doesn't matter. I think Satya Nadella from Microsoft, I probably butchered his name, sorry, I should know that. But he has actually gone on record saying that empathy-driven cultures change, and finance originally resisted it, but they vindicated it. So you can co-create, but you got to do it purposefully. You can't go on separate tracks.
There's an example that I used in another one of the episodes that we did, and I'll bring the example back up because I think it's pertinent here. We always want to talk about things like engagement scores. The CFO is never going to care or hear what the engagement score number is. But what they're going to hear that we fail to bring out, I think a lot of times, at least I have, is the impact of that. Teams with high engagement tend to produce 18% more than teams without engagement, right? So if you look at an area where you have low engagement in the business and you think about what is the production that is coming out of that area, right? We're either losing something or we are missing the opportunity to move the needle ahead by X amount. And so if we frame the engagement score in terms of what its impact is on productivity and translate that into dollars lost or opportunity for additional dollars, then that is an argument that I think both the CHRO and the CFO can jointly hear.
I think that's right, but let me push on that just a little bit. And this is going to be really unpopular. All engagement doesn't matter the same. And so just as all retention doesn't matter the same, having engagement in your pivotal roles is more important than having engagement every place else. Having good decision makers in your pivotal roles and having A players in your pivotal roles, back to kind of our first thing back in July 1st of this year. Like, there are jobs that matter more than other jobs in here. And unfortunately, we take a wide brush as we come in. And I think it's candidly because we show up to these things really defensively, as if we are already going to lose because finance has framed it in a way that it is sterile to the broader kind of method of production if people are involved. You and I both know inherently, I think most of our listeners would agree, if you have people as the means of production, having that production machine fully engaged and on path matters a ton to the outsized performance of the organization. And finance doesn't really think about it that way, but we walk in like totally defensive, because I'd say it's rational, candidly, because it feels more like the answer is predetermined and the conversation is more theater, because we need more margin. Okay, let's cut costs.
Yeah, I'm curious about your point of view on this, because it's certainly something I feel like I've contended with in my own career in the past. We've conditioned, as HR leaders, we've conditioned CFOs to believe a certain way because we have failed to do some things that would have produced a different outcome. And so I think sometimes the defensive-ness is like, I know what I'm going to get from you because I've always gotten it from you, and I've always gotten it from you because I conditioned you to respond that way. Or even probably more fair to the broader group, or somebody else conditioned you to feel that way. And I think that makes the point even more important, that to undo that conditioning, we've got to skew over a little bit toward the business metrics and toward framing things as you and I've been talking about, because you're undoing potentially years of conditioning to not hear you.
Okay, you ready to have me knock your socks off on this concept, and then we'll move on to something I promise. We
Totally.
can't get stuck here. But you've triggered this in me. I just want to throw out as a possibility. I'm not even sure I believe this, but maybe the problem is CHROs go to the forecast reviews because most of the input that we have should be done well in advance of that meeting. It's in the strategic allocation conversations. It's not in the budget defense sessions. And once we get in there, because we fought for the seat at the table and here we are in the room, the whole forum itself positions us as a supplicant to it. There's probably a better word for that, but it positions us as subordinate to whatever is happening in the room when candidly our conversations should have been had well in advance.
I actually think that may be a crux of the matter. And it's really two things. It's how do you speak the language of the business in the strategy session that makes you a priority so that it's a foregone conclusion when you get to the budget section about how you're going to allocate resources to support whatever the agreed upon priorities are.
Yeah, I think that's right on. And here's the truth. You don't win influence by out arguing finance. You win it by out informing them and making that business case so strong that they don't have to clean it up. And that means you have to do some math. So let's maybe think about it a little differently. And I want to explore what it looks like when HR and finance co-own the story and instead of competing for airtime. Scott, what would it be like if the CFO and the CHRO shared one performance dashboard?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it would have is, here's a theory about how we're going to gain more capability from our workforce, and here's evidence of where that is happening in either in part or in full. I think a thing that has to accompany that single dashboard is a shared mentality on experimentation. Right? You and I talk a lot about agile thinking. There are a lot of variables. I think one of the reasons I went into human resources as a profession rather than finance was there's this amazing number of variables that impact the ultimate outcome. And moving those levers sometimes is a little bit of experimentation. So if you're going to share a dashboard, it's great, I think, or, ideally you're sharing a mindset about that experimentation. How are we going to know what are our leading indicators and our lagging indicators that this is actually working, or that we need to make some adjustments, not abandon the program, but make some adjustments so that we produce the kind of return that we want. Because ultimately, if we're doing a program and it doesn't produce the return, finance was right to begin with. It's a cost. So it should be in both of our best interests to have a program that moves the business and the people, puts the people at the center of it, but can also show some return on the P&L.
Yeah, and let me just maybe nudge in with the concept that when I say one dashboard, what I don't mean is finance's dashboard, to your point. And you said it, I just want to pull it out and restate it maybe a little differently because I think it's really important. Finance doesn't have leading indicators. Their job is to look at the scoreboard and tell you what happened. And they call balls and strikes. There's a whole function called FP&A, which is what we think will happen next. But even those aren't based on leading indicators as much as pattern recognition and kind of forecasting based on various different inputs. HR, if we do our job well, is the place where you can balance the looking backwards with the looking forward. If I have stronger talent density, I have a higher likelihood and confidence that my plans will be executed appropriately. If I have lower, then I have lower. And oh, by the way, the higher my talent density in the jobs that have an outsized impact on performance, it literally changes the score. And so if you can combine those two things together, you're in a completely different situation than what we normally have. Here's a different thought, and I'd love to get your take on this. What if the CFO was HR's best internal customer? Because in my history, I've tried to build that relationship at the top and change that relationship, but it's been hard to get the balance of the organization around that. Like, I've always wanted to take care of the FP&A person. You know why? Because at some point I need them to if things are on the line, I need it nudged into my position. Like, is that a good strategy, or was I just being
Well, I mean,
whatever?
one, I don't think you're off the mark, but I think I mean, I don't know. What I'd like to believe is that great CFOs don't want to be HR's customer. They want to be HR's co-investor. I think the reality is that that is probably not, that's less the case than more. And I think that framing it as the CFO as an internal customer flips the power dynamic in some useful ways, but it also risks making the entire value proposition for HR about serving finance rather than serving the broader business.
Yeah, and let me be real clear. That is what I'm not saying. There is that we just kind of acquiesce to what finance wants to hear. That's not what I'm talking about at all. But if you have taken care of your ticket to ride and now you're co-creating stuff together, you're in a position, I think, where you can become the challenger. But it's like you talk about Cubby's emotional bank account all the time. I think we underinvest in that, and then when we do, we take a subordinate role in that relationship. And if you're a CHRO sitting at the top of the house, like, that is one of the critical partnerships to build. If you
Hmm.
if you underinvest in that, I think you're going to pay for it. Okay, so
Well,
what if we? Okay,
Can
go
I
ahead.
can I can I just add one tail thing to that,
Yeah,
Jackson? Because there's something in there that's really critical. There's a mentality about a relationship that you have with a customer, and what you just said last was really focused on building that relationship, and I think that is absolute gold, right? You need the relationship with the CFO. Where I think I just pause a little bit to consider is the action part. Because you and I both know the examples really, really well. I'll pull out two: Patagonia and Costco. Patagonia pays people to invest in environmental activism. They offer on-site childcare. They allow flexible work arrangements, and all of those things. When you looked at the numbers, they all look like cost centers. But they created a 4% turnover within Patagonia, which was in really stark contrast to the 60% industry average. And if you look at Costco, their example is well known. They pay 40% higher than their competitors like Walmart. They invest really heavily in employee benefits, things that are on their face. We're doing these nice things, but they're all cost things, which makes them easy to cut. And yet Costco delivered, 670% stock growth over the last 20 years. So those kinds of things, right? You want to build the relationship, but I'm not sure doing everything that finance wants is the right action to take, right? The relationship's important, the action's questionable.
well, I'm going to go back in time because I used to run a sales region where Costco was our primary customer, and the kind of region sales director for region finance director, a guy named Corey Gottschalk was his name. Great dude, literally a great dude. And he and I were at the hip on these things. The region that we were running is about $800 million business, almost 2,000 employees across 10 states. So it was a big piece of business. And we had these awards that were tied to performance against plan and improvement versus year ago. So there was an absolute performance and there was a relative performance element to it. And one of the weird parts about Frito at the time is they did not plan for full headcount. They said, okay, we know that we're going to have a 10% open rate, and so your budget is set, so you don't get the benefit of having that. The impact of that was, you got to be in a weird position because now I have to operate where I save money by not filling sales jobs, and yet I still have a top. Like it was a disconnected process.
Yeah.
Here's the point of the story. Corey and I spent a couple of days together, just like, okay, what do we have to do to turn this region around? And we decided we were going to overinvest in a couple of key areas. One of the places we were going to overinvest is we were not going to have any open jobs. So from an HR perspective, I built predictive systems that allowed us to anticipate where we were going to lose people, hire them ahead of need, and as soon as someone stepped up, we had another person coming in. And he figured out a way to fund that somewhere else in the business. And then we both held hands and jumped and said, when we do this, if it fails, we'll both get fired because we're going to blow our OPEX budget. And if it doesn't fail, we're going to eat like kings. And so what happened the first year we did that together? We won the Starfleet Award, and you can see it over my shoulder in the back. We won the award because we had the best year over year improvement, and we got kind of middle of the road in terms of overall performance. And then the weirdest thing happened the next year. We won the Starfleet Award again because we had the best relative performance and the best absolute performance. And if you were to talk to both Corey and I about what we did differently, there were a couple of sales initiatives and kind of where we made, let the big dogs hunt from a plan design standpoint. But where it really came down to, and this is a co-scorecard between finance and HR, is we were absolutely focused on making sure that we had the belly buttons in the seats ready to rock so that we could go hit the numbers, and our margin expanded even as we were spending more money than what we were originally planning to go do. That's an example of a co-creation of a strategy that has real results, and we've got to figure out a way to do that at more senior levels. So let's maybe start talking in what do we do about this when we kind of start on Monday. Scott, what do you think that playbook looks like? Number one.
I'm probably not going to get all of the elements here, but like I'll translate talent into capital, I think would be the first one, right? We need to build a bridge between the talent metrics that are important to us and the financial ones that are important to the CFO. And so, for example, tying one of your favorites, talent density to margin, or retention of top talent to EBITDA stability, right? Those are ways that we can create that bridge. Speed of impact to maybe cash flow. I don't know.
Yeah, I think those are all really good. You have to have that bridge. And then I think you build a joint scorecard. That's what I would do. And that's what Corey and I did. And hi, Corey, by the way, I'm going to send this to you. Nice shout out. Haven't talked to you for about 20 years, but still reveling in the glory of back-to-back Starfleet awards. If we have a joint scorecard, you have a balance between the leading and the lagging indicators, and you have one narrative, and that narrative helps the CEO, or in our case, the region vice president, lead in such a way that they can make the appropriate trade-offs, and we're not fighting over the data, and we're not fighting over what the plan is, because it's together. And I would argue you do that at the top chair in companies. When the CEO, CFO, and CHRO come in to present to the board, and you are all talking off the same sheets, like that's where the magic happens. Okay, that's what you got to do. But what else would you do?
Well, I was in addition to being in a chief people officer role, I was a chief of staff to a CEO, and he was a stickler on the numbers, and so I became a stickler on the numbers, and it made me realize that in my CHRO career, I wasn't probably ahead of those numbers as often as I should have been. So I think one of the Monday morning things is you got to come to the table prepared, right? You've got to preview the audit. You've got to, review the numbers before finance reviews them. You've got to understand what those numbers are saying. You've got to anticipate the questions that you're going to get from your finance partners. And if you are seen as a person who is coming with that level of preparedness and that level of fluency in what those numbers say, that builds credibility, and they start trusting your story.
Yeah. Look, you got a co-author the board slide. We talked about that a little bit. If the CFO is presenting it alone, you're invisible. If you write it together, like that's where the magic happens. And then you need to change the language to the one the finance uses. And I wish that weren't the case, but here's the reality. It's the one that everyone else uses. So you can either adopt, assimilate, or die, as the Star Trek people would say. So like, don't talk about initiatives, talk about investments. Don't talk about programs, talk about portfolio. Don't talk about training hours, talk about productivity yield. Those words matter and they shape belief. So, hey, we're running towards the end here. So it's time to get to our summary. Or as Scott always says, the quickest way to a CFO's heart is through a well-labeled pivot table.
I have literally never said that.
Exactly. That's why it's so damn funny.
That's why you're funny.
Okay, here's your Talent Sherpa summary. Hit it.
I'm doing the summary?
You always do the summary.
All right, here we go. The CHRO and the CFO are narrating the same business story, or at least they should be. The only question is whether you're going to write that thing together or whether you're trying to write it individually. That would be my first point. Second is recognize that finance respects precision. And so our passion sometimes seems misplaced. We've got to speak in ratios, not in adjectives. Build one operating language. A language that ties together the investments that we're trying to make in people to financial returns. And I think if I had a fourth point, it would be influence is earned when we kind of inform before finance interprets, where we get to control that narrative.
Yeah, look, human capital is financial capital with a longer maturation cycle. That's the big idea here. So if you treat it that way, finance will fund your story. If you don't treat it that way, finance will rewrite your story. Okay, so let's wrap this up. I just want to say thank you for tuning into the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where, as you know, senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. And on a personal note, this is so much fun to do with y'all. I'm just grateful that you listen. And I want to give a quick shout out to one of our favorite listeners. Hey, Debbie in Chicago. Thank you for being a part of the Talent Sherpa community.
If you like today's episode, please take a second right now while you're thinking about it and hit the like button or subscribe to the podcast, which is better. We are really pushing to raise the number of subscribers that we have. Leave us a review on your favorite platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube. We are ubiquitous. We are everywhere. Here's our challenge. We are trying to build to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. We are adding at a really steady rate. We would really appreciate your support. Click subscribe right now. It's free and it would be really helpful to us.
And if you're a CHRO wondering where to start your AI journey because your CEO is saying, we need you to do AI, please don't forget to check out Propulsion AI. You can do that at the really cleverly titled www.getpropulsion.ai. They are building a team of AI teammates to help human capital leaders focus on what really matters to the business. It's really cool.
And if you don't realize it already, Jackson works with new and emerging CHROs to accelerate your impact. So if you're tired of white knuckling it by yourself, head on over to www.mytalentsherpa.com. You're going to find a curated set of resources that Jackson's created specifically to help you navigate, elevate, and deliver results from day one. You can even sign up for, and I'm excited I get to say this once again, the best-selling Talent Sherpa weekly Substack right there. So go to talentsherpa.substack.com to do it, or mytalentsherpa.com.
We'll take you to either of the two websites. So thanks, Scott. And thank you to everyone who is listening and helping make this thing that we decided to do earlier this year. It's like growing like a weed, and it's so much fun. And until next time, keep raising the bar, keep aligning the narrative, and keep on climbing.